Let's go. Okay, so first of all, really quick, who am I? Jorge Abreu. I live here in Toronto. I'm a site reliability engineer, and I'm originally from the province of Buenos Aires in Argentina. Province of Buenos Aires is something like Ontario, for example, and the capital city, the only difference is that it has the same name, so it's Buenos Aires City instead of Ottawa. And my first computers were, that thing that came back, were the CZ spectrum. We are going to see in a second why the CZ spectrum. And the TI-99/4A, because Texas Instrument was leaving the US market and they had like 100,000 machines left. And they were like, let's ship them to South America. It's on the side. Yeah, that's it. My fault. It was nice in purple. Um, no stories about the TI-99/4A right now. I need to research a little bit more about it, but it's super interesting how they went there and tried to sell what remnants they have from Italy and the US. Now, let's get into this. So, Drean Commodore was fairly popular in Argentina, and there was a lot of misconceptions around it for a long time, especially in internet regarding like in the retro community and so on. It was usually called a clone in many forums or many communications that I have seen around, and like a year ago, I was like, I'm going to do proper research, like since I can read Spanish, like I'm gonna read interviews, I'm gonna watch interviews and so on, try to find how this came to be, how it ended up like looking like a clone, and what's the reality of it, right? By the way, it was kind of like a Commodore 64 advertising, but I think that it's using the Commodore 16 there for it, so it's kind of like a weird thing that they did. Now, Argentina. Argentina is the almost most southern country in America. Chile got like one or two islands in the southern border, but we have the biggest city at the southern border, which is Ushuaia. So we say that we are the most southern city in the world. Now, in the American continent. Now, where computers started in Argentina started in the 60s when a professor from a university, the University of Buenos Aires, was able to convince the government and the university to buy a computer because he was like, okay, this is going to be the future. We need a computer. So they got a Ferranti Mercury from UK. It had a floating point unit because it was made to make mathematical calculations. It had core memory, which was something new at the time. This is late 50s. And it could make a subtraction in 180 microseconds, which was wild at the time. Now, all this was thanks to the professor Manuel Sadowski, and that's going to be a name. There's going to be one or two more times here. In Argentina, that computer was known as Clementina because one of the programs that came with the Ferranti Mercury was the song "Oh My Darling Clementine" to test it. So you test it, and it kind of like made that sound, and because of it, it was known as Clementina. So no one knows the name Ferranti Mercury, but everyone knows what Clementina was. And of course, respects to the woman computing of the time. Something interesting while I was doing research for this is that I found the original manual, and somewhere, there's the PDF of the original manual around. And that's a picture of the actual core memory that they installed in the Ferranti Mercury. Now, Argentina being Argentina, not everything is super high. So at this time, there was always like 6-7 years of democracy, and then we were back into a dictatorship again. In 66, one of the bloodiest again, between 66 and 73, and they had the bright idea that not only they were like going against civil rights and that kind of things, they also were against how it was taught in universities. And universities at the time, they were kind of like, they had autonomy to decide what courses to teach and how. And the military didn't like it that much. So they went to the University of Buenos Aires. There was a bunch of professors and students inside, and they basically kicked them out of the university. One of those professors was Sadowski. Because we also get into many troubles all the time, democracy after 73 didn't last too long. In 74, the right-wing side of the Peronist party was starting to rally against the most left side hand of the same party, and they started to send their threats to everyone who was not aligned with the right-wing side of the party. Those death threats were real. They were not only threats. And to make things worse, in 76 we got again in a dictatorship. This guy, Ortega Peña, was it was what we call a diputado, which is here will be a member of parliament. So they were actually killing members of the parliament of their own party that did not align with what they were thinking for the party. At this time, this was the bill of the time. It lasted from 1970 to 1983. It was called the Peso Argentino Ley. Usually people will refer to it as the Peso Ley. Now, we are in the 70s. Dictatorships, democracy, dictatorships again. And a company in one of the provinces in Argentina is making electric motors. One of the customers for this company is IBM. IBM was assembling mainframes in Argentina, and they needed electric motors for the printers. So they got in touch with this small company, and they made step motors for them, and they got in touch, and they got relationships, and they started to get interested in this whole thing of calculations and computers. So that's one of the kind of like the computers of the time that they will have been making motor for them, for IBM. And meanwhile, in this side of the hemisphere, as you know, that's supposed to say 70s, but I finished this at 12:30 last night, so I made a mistake. You guys were having fun with these kind of things, right? A lot of you probably had an Apple II and so on. I had to include the TI-99/4 because it's beautiful to me. It's like a DeLorean, so I had to include it. So at the same time, in Argentina, we were not able to innovate and advance at the same pace, but some of these things were starting to get into the country. And Cerveni, this company that was making the motors for IBM, was like, what if we do calculators? Like they are smaller, they are simpler, and they have a real use that is easy to sell. Something like Commodore and many others, right? And Texas Instruments, like everyone was doing the same thing as a first step. At the same time, there was another company that we are going to mention quite a few times here that was making washing machines. There is Drean. And there was another company called Talent that they were making TVs at the time. So now we are at the end of the 70s, starting of the 80s, and three machines reach three different markets around the world. You have in North America the Commodore 64, the Spectrum in the UK and Europe, and the MSX standard starting in Japan. But in Argentina, we are always like, we have other things to think about all the time. So in 81, it's been already 5 years since the last military coup. And they are not releasing the power back to the people. They are not calling for elections. They are not restoring the parliament. And they are not letting the laws to be voted around. They are doing everything by decree, basically. And there's a lot of missing people. There's a lot of killed people that is not appearing and so on. And to make things worse, the parties started to align between each other and say, hey, we all need to be together and ask the military government, hey, it's enough. It's been 5 years. You said that it's going to be a couple of years, and then we are back into democracy, and that didn't happen. So the military didn't take it so well. And they thought we need something that will unify the whole country under one flag and make them forget that we are still in power and make them forget that we are not calling for an election. So they found we had two geographical conflicts at the time. One with Chile and one with Great Britain. With Chile, it was kind of like a silly conflict about the lines that divide the Andes between Chile and Argentina, but it was like it's 200 kilometers on this side or 1 kilometer on that side or 200 meters on this side. It was more of a disagreement than something to go to war to. And with Britain, we we had two islands that we inherited from Spain in the 1800s. And then in 1833, I think it was, the UK got into the islands, kicked off everyone who was there. And since then, Argentina was kind of like diplomatically trying to get the islands back. So they were like, what if we take over the islands by force and make everyone feel nationalistic again? Because they needed a big nationalistic cause. It can be something small. It needs to be something big that everyone is going to agree, yes, we finally got the islands back. Well, it didn't work that way, as you can imagine. The guy that you see in the top, that was the dictator at the time, that was in charge of the government, his name is Galtieri. He was known for drinking too much. And there he's basically saying, like, if they want to come, let them come, we will fight them. An idiot guy. Now, on the bottom left side, you see Sinclair, our favorite guy in the 8-bit computing for cheaper machines, right? And here you have Timex, which I got one yesterday, thankfully. Super cheap here. Love these people. Now, the thing is that Timex, I don't know, many of you know, Timex was actually in Portugal, and they were assembling the Sinclair computers for the US, basically, US and Canada. So, that means that even if you are at war with the UK and you don't have diplomatic relations with the UK, but you have diplomatic relations with Portugal, they are not the same country. So there's a chance. So what they did is that one of the decrees that the military government had in the late 70s was to go in kind of like a neoliberal thinking. So they opened the full imports of things, they opened all the markets and so on, which works if you have like a strong currency maybe, or if you export more than you import. In our case, we imported more than what we exported, and we had a currency that every 10 years we were changing currencies. So that didn't work out. But while it worked, they were able to import from Portugal the Timex machine, change the label, change the RF modulators for PAL-N, and then resell them into the market. Argentina is kind of like a Dunning-Kruger effect with a go-to. But it's kind of like an inverse Dunning-Kruger effect, because we're actually spiraling down. Then we have either a dictatorship or we go back into democracy. Things start to go right and good again. Then they start to go bad again, and then we go back to the start. So this is how usually any chart of Argentina looks like. Like if you look at, I don't know, an inflation chart from Canada, is like it barely moves. Sometimes it's like 3, 4, 9 at worst last year, 2 years ago, I think. Now, this here, this is yearly inflation. This is 900. This is 1,000. This is not 10 or 9. And here you can see why we had to change currencies, because the inflation was eating up the currency so much with the imports that you need to change currencies, because otherwise you end up with like 6 zeros in your bills. So again, go to the start. So 83, 85, so before we got back into democracy, the currency changed again, because everything that I said before. And we changed from the peso argentino ley to the peso argentino, which are not the same thing. And on December 10th of 1983, finally, we were back in democracy. And the inflation rate for these 3 years was 340 yearly, 620, and 670. This is also to show you how hard it was to do business, maintain a business, have an industry, sell stuff, pay for bills, pay for taxes, and keep track of that in a yearly manner, and knowing how much did you earn or not after a year. This is how a peso argentino looks like. And kind of like a circle of life, Manuel Sadowski, after the democracy is back, he was invited to the country again. He fled after the dictatorship. He lived in Venezuela sometime, in Spain sometime, in Uruguay. Of course, he founded like computational institutions and so on. So when he was back, the president invited him as Secretary of Science and Technology. And the woman below was a woman that worked with him, Rebecca Geber, was a mathematician that worked with the computer that we saw before a lot. So in the 80s, then one of the last decrees that the military government does, and remember that this is the funny part, the military governments open the full imports of everything in a super liberal way, or libertarian way, I should say. In Spanish, we say kind of like liberal, and I always mess it up. In kind of like a libertarian way. But in '83, they found that they don't have any more US dollars. Nobody will lend them money because a year ago you went at war with one of our main founders of the EMF and so on. So how are you going to ask us for money? So without any big bank lending money to the country, there was no more US dollars to full import of everything. So what did they do is that they made a decree that if a computer has less than 256 kilobytes of memory, it could not be directly imported, and it needed to be assembled locally. But if you assemble it locally, you will have tax exemptions, and you could import without taxes the means needed to assemble that computer. So that's how we got again to Cerveni, the company that was making the electric motors, and then it was importing the 1500s, the Timex 1000. They built the Spectrum. Again, officially, what they did was the main chips from Sinclair were sent to Timex in Portugal and from Timex to Argentina. And the case looks kind of weird because most of the components that they could resource locally, they will source them locally. So the plastics were made in Argentina. And I assume that it was simpler to make them like squarish instead of the round one, and that's why they went with that design. And as you can see here, it doesn't either look like the original Spectrum or the Spectrum Plus. It's kind of like something in the middle of the two. This is the inside. Nothing super interesting except the two things that you see on the top there. The original Spectrum didn't have either joystick ports or a reset button. So what they do is that since we are assembling it all again, and since we are not using the original case and we are building the case from scratch, let's add something else. And something interesting that they do is that they choose to use DIN ports. So you had to buy the joysticks from them, and you could not use Atari joysticks. There you have a look on the side. And on the back, as you can see, it was super easy to do because the reset button just goes to the processor and there's a pin for the reset. And then the joystick port, it connects, I think, to some of the keys on the keyboard. And that's it. There's nothing super interesting on the mod that they did. These are some advertisements of the time. Of course, they push the cheapness of the machine, the capabilities, the colors, standard Spectrum stuff. And this is a look at the height of the company, how things were looking. They were making 4,000 Spectrums per month, which at the time Argentina had around 20 million, 22 million population, so it was a fairly good number for a computer. And they were making the PCBs locally, the plastics locally, everything except the chips. 80s, we go back to our favorite brand today. So in the 80s, Drean, who has been, as we mentioned before, doing washer machines, was already doing TVs, kitchens, and a lot of household appliances. And they will basically build them, assemble, or design some of them, and then they will distribute to big retailers like the kind of like Best Buy. But in Argentina, they are called Frávega and Garbarino. They are like the two big brands for retailing. And they had, of course, because they were the most known brand, this is a key element on the story, they had extremely good relationships with these two distributors of retail. And this is another key, they had big budget for advertisement and to doing business. And as you can imagine, in a context, an economical context so complicated like this one, dealing with a company that has that wallet, it makes a difference. This is a short advertisement of a washing machine. I don't know what they are dressing the ducks, but okay. And they were also making TVs at this time. They got a partnership with ITT. I think that from Germany. I don't remember from where ITT was. Europe, let's say. And similar to Commodore, ITT was providing a lot of the technical specs and details, and they will assemble and manufacture the TVs. So then we got into Drean coming to the US to talk with Commodore. And Commodore was like, okay, we'll let you import the computer. But Drean was like, yeah, it's more complicated than that. Like, it's not that easy. So we cannot fully directly just import them. We need to assemble them locally. And Drean was like, if we are going to assemble it and we are going to print the boxes and we are going to distribute it, we want our name on it. We want to call it the Drean 64. And Commodore was like, no, it's the Commodore 64. So they were not agreeing on what to do until Commodore, the story goes something like Commodore was like, if you can make a big purchase right now, we can discuss that. And Drean supposedly offered buying 100,000 units at the moment. And Commodore, if you remember, in '85, they were starting to struggle a little bit. They were struggling to release the Amiga. They were waiting for the 128. They were about to release the 64C. So they had a lot of machines in the background that were not selling. They had a lot of issues with Apple and with Atari and the competitors. So they were like, okay, if you can pay for that in cash, we take it. And that's how Commodore ended up agreeing on Drean having the name on everything. So basically, what Commodore did was letting the brand being managed by Drean in Argentina, which was fairly uncommon for Drean around the world. And that's how we got, again, into Drean Commodore. And as you can imagine, they were targeting business, all the business capabilities, all the gaming capabilities, everything on the advertisement. Now, this is the Drean Commodore 64. This is the breadbin version. If any of you have not seen these machines, you can watch it on my table and play with them. Basically, they are almost the same machine that the ones NTSC. So how they build them is that to make things even cheaper, like these were really smart people that we are talking here that were doing business. So what they arrange is that Commodore will have the assembly line, and when the Commodores in the US reached the end of the assembly line, they had to be tested, right? If that test anything failed, they will put it in a first discard sector. And they will stay in that first discard sector and everything will get desoldered. And then once a month, someone from Argentina will come back. They will look at the first discard. They will select the ones that they are going to take, and Drean paid by the ton. I don't remember exactly how much, but Commodore will fill like a full box of these PCBs and the chips necessary and everything, and they will weight them and ship them. And then they were completely reassembled and soldered in Argentina. And what you are seeing here, this is a big 2 chip. This is a 6572. That's the only MOS chip that can handle PAL-M. And I thought that this picture is interesting to illustrate you why this is not a clone. Not only this is not a clone, but Commodore had to make a chip specially for us. Because in Argentina we had PAL-M, which is different from PAL, and it's different from NTSC. And it's even different from PAL-M from Brazil. To illustrate a little bit of the differences, on the first few lines, everything is almost the same, except the last 2 lines. So on the clock cycles per scan line, PAL-M is closer to NTSC. So if you plug a PAL-M machine into an NTSC monitor, at worst, it looks in black and white. But because the color subcarrier frequency is closer to NTSC than to PAL, if you connect it to a PAL monitor, it usually moves and it's unable to interpret the signal. So it's the worst of both worlds, and they had to make a special big 2 chip for us. By the way, and this is just another sub quest, that this was because that frequency, the 4.4 megahertz, was being used for something else that I don't remember exactly. So they couldn't have the color signal going into the same frequency that other thing that I don't remember, because that was that spectrum was used at the time that TVs were black and white. So they were not thinking, oh, someone someday is going to use this frequency for color. Now, there's something interesting about the Drean Commodores, that if you ever have a Drean Commodore, on the back, it's going to say assembled on the province of San Luis. But if you look at the manual, it's going to say that the factory is in the province of Buenos Aires. So what happened there? Drean had 2 factories, one in San Luis and one in Buenos Aires. The one of San Luis had tax exemptions. The one in Buenos Aires didn't. So what they did sometimes is that they will assemble and solder them in Buenos Aires, they will ship them to San Luis, and then they will distribute from San Luis as it was just assembled to get the tax break from that province. This is how it looks in the manual, and here's where you can see that the first page says this machine was manufactured by Drean San Luis, and here it says that the factory is in the province of Buenos Aires. Drean Commodore was big. That's another question that sometimes I get, like, okay, how popular was it? How big was it? It has its own magazines. Drean didn't spare a dime on making not only advertisement, but user groups, like magazines, TV shows. You could go and win a Drean Commodore 64, that kind of things. And the owner of Drean, this is beautiful. And you have to agree this is beautiful. The owner of Drean was a racing guy, not only a business guy. And his son is a multi-champion on national racing stuff in Argentina. His name is Besone, Celestino Besone. And he raced on a car with the Commodore brand on the top, as you can see. It's beautiful. It's just beautiful. Yes, I was going to mention that if you want to see that car someday, and if you are into racing, this picture is a little bit old. I will need to double check if it's still there. But there's if you know motor racing, you maybe have heard about Fangio. Fangio was the best Formula One driver from Argentina, right? And there's a museum about Fangio, and right close to the museum, there's another one that has this car. And this picture is from that museum. That's where you can see a plaque like on the side. And the guy not only liked racing and had the Commodore brand, he holds the record for the oldest driver to win. And he won at 62 years old in 1995 at the height of Drean Commodore and Commodore itself. I look at the factory when they were assembling and soldering the computers, because this is another misconception that I have seen many times, that it wasn't clear if it was only a label change, if there was something done. And as we established, at the very least, they had to desolder the original Big 2 chip and for NTSC, and they had to solder a new one with PAL-N and reassemble everything. So we are back to Drean Commodore. Very 80s, very 80s. It screams 80s. And as Argentina goes, in 85, between 85 and 90, we had to change the currency again. And this is something that is going to be interesting to show you. This is another side quest that I thought that it was interesting at best. So we had to change the currency from peso argentino to australes. Austral is basically southern. So the yearly inflation during this period, 85 to 90, 600, 90%. Some 86 was okay. Like for our standards, that was like really low inflation. 130, 340, 3,000, 2,000. So when you think about inflation, those numbers not only are hard to comprehend, but also when we think in terms of inflation, here we think on, I don't know, the milk going from $1 to 120 and then 130 and then 140. In currencies, how this looks is like you have a bill of 1 Austral, and then you have a bill for 1,000 Australs, and then you have a bill for 5,000 Australs. And it keeps like drifting away in comparison with the US dollar, and then you have the 10,000, and you are going to remember better than me, but I think that we have coins for 10,000 Australes, if I remember, and I think that we have bills for 100,000. Yeah. So then we are, that was 85, now we are in the 86, and sadly, it was a bad year for Cerveni. So if you remember, we mentioned Cerveni did the electric motors, then they imported the Sinclairs, then they built the Spectrum, right? And they were making 4,000 machines per month, non-stop. And if you remember, we went at war with the UK and all that. It's an interesting story. Now, this all comes together in a super interesting, dark way that in 10th of June of 1986, there was a fire in the factory for Cerveni, and no one knew that there was a fire. So the night, almost the next day on the 11th, they found out about the fire. It was already too late to stop it, the spread, so it basically burned the whole factory. And that happened. Why no one was on the 10th of June and why no one knew? Because it was the day of reaffirmation of the rights of the Malvinas Islands. It was a day that was spared because of what happened with the islands. So bad luck and an interesting coincidence there. By the way, Cerveni was never able to recover from that. They took months to try to reassemble everything again and basically reassemble what was needed for the agreements that they already had with distributors, and then it was already too late. After 87, it was really hard to sell a Spectrum in a market that already had Commodore 64, 64C, the 128 coming, the rumors about the Amiga, and so on and so on. So, in 86, at the lows of Cerveni and the Spectrum, we got the most Argentinian Commodore ever lived in the country, the 64C. And why is that? The Commodore 64C, Commodore didn't want to release it in Argentina. They already had too many problems at the time. They were trying to sell the Plus 4, the 128, the 64C, the Amiga. Amiga 500 was about to be released. It was a mess of they were fighting with themselves. They were trying to, I don't know, to bankrupt themselves. And they didn't need to deal with Argentina with 600% of inflation and not understanding what was going on there. So having to continue making the big two chip and so on, and they were like, no, we just don't want to. They will need to print the new PCB, shorter PCB, and so on, and train the Argentinian technicians. It was too much of a hassle for them. But Drean in Argentina, they had a lot of customers and retailers asking for the 64C because they heard that in the US was the next big thing. It's like it's better, it's cheaper, it's all of these new things which we know it's not, but the people thought it was. And Drean was like, we need the 64C. So basically what they did is that they made the molds of the plastics themselves. They used the Commodore 64 breadbin PCB, just a standard PCB, and converted into the case for a 64C and sold it for quite a while as the 64C. So remember, as if anyone here is a collector, remember when you are buying a Drean Commodore 64C that it's a 64 breadbin with a plastic case change. And here you can look at the inside, and this is the classic PCB for a breadbin machine. And this is how it looks in a PAL machine in a 64C from Germany. As you can see, the PCB is shorter, it's only to the half. It has way less chips, it has way less passive components and so on. And here you can see the plastics on the inside. Another interesting thing here is that the Drean Commodore 64C, it has full 6 screws around. The 64C, the most ones that I have seen from Germany, especially on the PAL side, they had plastic clamps to get the covers. And here you can see Drean Commodore in the plastic inside because they were making the plastics, of course. Now the keyboard, it's something interesting. I wasn't able to confirm where the keyboard came from. And again, I want to be real because I did a lot of research and there are things that are hard to confirm. One of those is that in many interviews, technicians from Drean said that some of the keyboards were made in Argentina. I'm not exactly sure. This is supposedly one of those keyboards. I'm not 100% sure. This one is the one in the PAL machine from Germany. It has a Mitsumi. It's clearly the Argentinian is not a Mitsumi, and they are not exactly the same, so I'm not sure. I didn't do anything this time. You see, this time it wasn't me. And this is a look at the front of the keyboard, just in case that someone recognizes it or want to see it in detail in close up. And this is the two side by side. On the bottom, this is the Drean Commodore 64C. At the top is the Germany PAL one. Some differences that are clearly to see is the power LED. In the Drean, it's rounded, which was super common in Argentina, the round LEDs at that time. On the PAL machine from Germany, it's a rectangle. And then you have the sticker, it's millimeters longer, the Drean one, it's almost the same. The case has different angles. That's why on the picture it might look like one is bigger than the other, but that's just because of how the shapes of the sides are. This is the back. Something that you can notice is that this is the PAL Germany one, that the text is part of the plastic. And in the Drean, they were not able to do that for some reason. And they use it kind of like serigraphy. I don't know the technical term for it. And it's basically printed over. On the backs, here is more noticeable, that thing that one looks bigger than the other, but that's just because of the shape of the wings. If you have them both side by side, they are exactly the same. And you can see differences on how the mold was made and where they put the Commodore sign. The Germany one has the Commodore sign into the plastic, the Drean doesn't. And this is the most easy one to see, that because they were using the 64 bread bin PCB, they had to use the metal plate that grabs all the input output. In the 64C PAL from Germany, it's part of the plastics, so they just have that kind of like as a hole to hold the metal thing. And here you can see more noticeable the differences of the angles of the plastics and why they look sometimes different, but they are actually exactly the same size. Now, I was curious because someone, I don't remember if it was at BCF East or where, that someone asked me, how popular were they? Right? And that's a tricky question because if I say they sold 100,000 units, it's hard to say if that was popular or not, because someone will tell me, oh, that was terrible because they sold like 3 million in the US, right? And it's like, yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure. So I did kind of like a math about it. Take this with a grain of salt and like plus minus something. But the point that I was trying to make here is, okay, I'm gonna do some numbers and try to see how big is the gap on popularity, making it on population versus sales, right? The sales part was really hard. I had to read a lot of statements from Commodore, end of the year statements from Commodore, saying how much they sold on each reissue each year. And I had to add all that between 85 and 89. So the Drean Commodore in that period sold approximately 300,000 units, and Commodore itself on their main markets sold around 4 million. So adding the population of the main countries where it was being sold, right? Like not adding a couple hundred thousands from some smaller markets that they had, it roughly gave me that their popularity was a 1.1%. So they were reaching 1.1% of the market that they had available in the big countries that they were selling. And in Argentina, that same number gave me around 1.07. So even if the math is not perfect, it shows you how Commodore was exactly the same popular wherever it go. So it went to Argentina, even as Drean Commodore, and even with all that we saw before, and they were still as popular as they were in other countries. And just to finish the tangent, if you remember that we mentioned Talent before, that they were making TVs, so they got in communication with Daewoo from South Korea because the South Koreans were building an MSX machine and they wanted something like that in Argentina and Brazil because they thought that there was a market for it, especially because of the difference of language with the US machines. And they got in touch with this guy that is Carlos Manzano. He got in touch with Talent, and Talent basically had the money and the manufacturing capabilities. He had the contacts and the knowledge, and they, in the same way that Drean, they had a lot of advertisement capital to spend. This is Maradona. Basically, at this time, he was at the height of popularity. He's the most known, or maybe now it's Messi, but it was the most known footballer of all time from Argentina. And this is at the height of fame of Diego Maradona. And they had to get a Microsoft license for Microsoft Basic. And this is an interesting story, super quick, interesting story. So they went to South Korea and they were like, okay, so we have some manufacturing capabilities. We can do the plastics. We can make the power supply. We can make the PCBs because it's 2 layers only. And we cannot do the chips. That was never a capability that we had. And we cannot do the ROMs, especially legally. So how much is going to cost the Microsoft Basic ROM? And the South Koreans were like, oh, we get them at $5 a piece. And the Argentinians were like, yeah, I don't know if you made the numbers, but $5 is like 5,000 Australians. That's like a lot of money. We cannot spend $5 a piece just for the ROM chip of Microsoft Basic. So the Koreans were like, okay, go talk to Microsoft. Like, we cannot change that pricing. So after the dictatorship, a lot of companies started to come back to Argentina to open offices. One of those companies was Microsoft, that recently opened an office in the center of the capital city after the dictatorship ended. So they went there and they were like, hey, we are talking with South Koreans about building MSX machines, but they want $5 a piece. You know how this goes. But they were like, yeah, but we don't make the deals. Like, the deals are made upstairs. Like, we cannot sign you any type of discounts. So they went to the US and they presented the idea of making the Daewoo DPC 2000 in Argentina. And they got in touch with Bill Gates. And in 1985, if you don't remember how Bill Gates looked like, this is how he looked like. It would have been funny if you enter because you had like, yeah, Bill Gates is waiting for you and you enter and he's in the middle of this photo shoot and he's this young guy in his 30s like over the desk. It's so bizarre. Now they go to him and he did not become a billionaire by giving discounts. So at first he was like, no, because if we give you a discount, everyone is gonna want a discount. But at the end of the day, they were like, well, you know, Argentina, we have a different market and we really need this. It's going to be popular. It's going to be super interesting. And the MSX is really the only machine that we can make capable of having software in Spanish with the characters that we need. And Bill Gates, after 3-4 days of meetings with these Argentinians, like, we are annoying. And they were able to get a discount and they got a $1 a copy of Microsoft Basic for MSX. And here you can see why the MSX was important to write in Spanish if you have business, if you're writing letters, if you're writing formal stuff or if you are teaching. Like two words and just one symbol, and they are completely different words. And of course, this made available software for education. And one of those software for education that you might remember from the 70s and early 80s was Logo. And Logo was taught at schools to teach children how to program and understand logic functions, understand repetitions, and so on. I had Logo in school. I haven't used it yet, but at some point I hope that I'm going to use it for something. And so we had MSX Logo and the HAL Logo. And as you can see, instead of writing forward, right, left, and so on, you can write in Spanish. So to children, when they are not yet in the years that they start learning languages, we usually have English from when we are 7 or 8 until the end of high school. But before that, you cannot teach them English and Logo and computers, everything at the same time. Like it's a mess. So with Logo, they could teach them in Spanish, and it's easier to understand what the repetition is, what forward is, and so on. And of course, the sales pitch for grown-ups and for businesses and for banks was mostly that they could run Microsoft Multiplan and go to their houses and continue looking at spreadsheets at home for whatever reason that you want to do that. I don't know who will go from the bank and will say like, oh yes, I'm gonna tell my wife I have the MSX machine, now I can continue working on the spreadsheets from home. Yeah, definitely. And this is how the MSX, the Talent MSX looks for Argentina. And also you can see that the table working and everything. And here you can see that I think that it was a similar case with the Apple II here in North America, that the advertising target heavily onto children, telling their parents how good were these machines that they were using at school. It's like, Dad, you know, this MSX that we have at school is it's so intelligent and nothing is impossible from it. And I'm closing, don't worry. And after more than 300,000 Commodore 64 sold, then it was the time of the Commodore 128. But they were not assembling anymore. We got into a neoliberal government again, but this time in democracy at least. So again, full imports, so they could just directly import and resell. The 128, it's an NTSC machines, because at that time, televisions were already what we call binorma. I don't know the term in English, but basically they could have PAL or NTSC at the same time, and they could change between them. So it was the NTSC machine, and the only thing that changed, it's the label, and that the box was printed with Drean Commodore instead of Commodore. So please don't pay that. Like, unless you are super millionaire and you want to have every single Commodore out there in the world, don't pay 700,000 for 700 for Adrian Commodore's 128. It's just a label and a box. If you want, I print the box and the label for you, and you pay that for me. And this is the end. But the funny story is that if you remember something that I mentioned at the beginning, Commodore gave the brand to be managed by Drean in Argentina. So the brand in Argentina never stopped existing. We had Commodore computers until very recently. So I actually at some point worked at a company where I had to make a Linux distribution for it. It worked. So at some point there was Commodore machines with Linux on it. And it was a beautiful machine. And they continued having advertising and everything, and we even had tablets from Commodore. So that's something that you might want in your collection now. So this is the end. Thank you. Please. I don't know. He is the guy who can tell me if I can have questions or not.
Oh, I'm good. Do the questions for sure.
Sure?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay.
The C64C era, when they were using the bread bin board and all that, were they still paying licensing?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They just licensed that.
So Commodore wasn't happy with it,
Yeah.
but they liked the money from the agreement. So they didn't break the relations. That's why the Commodore 128 existed.
So it's all above board all the way through.
Yeah. So the 128, they still had good relationships because Commodore had to provide those 128 machines. They were not buying them at market value. But yeah, Commodore wasn't happy about it.
Hi, yeah, so you might not know the West of this, but since Argentina, because of their government, they had to make everything locally, right, because of political constraints. And Commodore was more than happy to sell them the defective parts, of course, because they basically got money for it. Did Commodore perhaps get ideas that they could do this in other, say, communist countries or other countries? And if so, why didn't
Right.
they do it?
So it's a good question. I think that the answer has to do because of Drean money and willing to do it. I think that is because it's not that Commodore approached Argentina. It's that Drean went to Commodore with, we have this budget, we have this wallet, and we can buy you all these 1,000 units right now.
And they have the distribution of it.
Exactly. And we already have the distribution network. We have already the retailers, the two biggest retailers of the country. So you have everything under control. And this was right after the dictatorship end. So the risk wasn't that high still because it was democracy, it was a free market. So everything was still kind of like okay to the business.
So I know this may be really difficult to answer with the hyperinflation you had, but there were a couple of early ads you showed for the Spectrums, and they had sort of a price there.
Yes.
How did that compare to, say, the price of the Spectrum in the UK? Like, was it priced equally, bare bones, cheap?
No, usually it was expensive. It was more expensive than in the US or the UK. But importing it would have been more expensive too. So buying it locally, and something that we had in Argentina that I think that is starting to appear here too, is that because of inflation, we always had things like breaking in installments or payments when you buy something. So if you buy assembly locally from the big retailers, you can make it in 12 or 24 installments. And you cannot do that with an import one that you pay all at once. And you need the US dollars to do the import.
Sorry, you go ahead.
Was there anything different in the kernel or the basic?
Nothing. Same chip provided by Commodore.
Was
That
it,
was-
was it in Spanish?
Not the kernel, yes, Shios.
I was going to ask more in terms of the TI situation because you said they just dumped them. How do they get around not having it manufactured in Argentina then?
If you want, we can discuss that outside because it's going to be a long answer and I don't want to take the time for the next. Yeah.
Sorry, just to follow up on the financial stuff. You said that it was the Argentina peso was revalued 3 times, right? For between the devaluations, what was the kind of, because usually it's like they take it's a million is one of the new peso or something like that. I was
Yes.
wondering the scale and also how Drean and those other manufacturers, like, how do they price their products? Because I mean, if it's going up 600%, like you put it as $1,000 today, in 3 weeks, if I got it at $1,000, it's half price.
Well, we cheat, and you're gonna remember that more than me. But and we still do this today. So we think in terms of US dollars, but we price in local currency. So let's say that the price is 100 US dollars. So today is 1,000 Australes. Then we have the evaluation, and tomorrow is 5,000 Australes. But the price is still $100, and that happens overnight.
Okay. So basically, the pricing is all based on whatever the solid currency is.
Yep.
And then
Yep. And that's true still today. Like if you go today to see prices and next month to see prices of the same thing, it's gonna be a little bit more expensive. Not that much because of inflation. Usually it's because the measurement with the dollar. That's it. Thank you. I don't want to take any more time. If you want, we can discuss that one outside. Thank you.